Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bill Kristol, member of Knesset Tzipi Livni, Bernard-Henri Lévy, and David Gregory.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Washington, all of you. It's great to see three great panelists here for what I hope will be an enlightening conversation. It's nice to be back with all of you during a fairly busy time here in Washington. I'm sure there's a few questions that you might have, and as your proxy, I will try to address them. My intent here is to spend this time with these wonderful folks kind of looking at the world and doing that through a Jewish lens, to try to understand what are the challenges and the opportunities that we as Jews face here and around the world, given the political climate we're in here and internationally, the security climate we're in, the economic climate we're in, and indeed the Jewish climate that we're in, which is to try to think about who we are as Jews and our Jewish identity and how that identity can interface with any number of these problems or these relationships. So that's where I'd like to get us started. I'm joined by people you all know. Tzipi Livni is, of course, the co-leader of the Zionist Union. She's held almost every major senior position in the government of Israel, including Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Justice, and member of the National Security Cabinet. Welcome, Tzipi.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bernard-Henri Lévy is here. He's, of course, the French philosopher and writer. He's written more than 30 books. His latest is The Genius of Judaism, a good title, don't we think? The Guardian recently noted that Lévy is accorded the kind of adulation in France that most countries reserve for their rock stars. No wonder he spends a lot of time there. Who wouldn't want that? And our friend Bill Kristol is here as well. Welcome, Bernard. Our friend Bill Kristol is here, the editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard. He worked in both the Reagan and the Bush administrations, the first Bush administration. Prominent member of the Jewish community in America, and is certainly somebody who is well-versed in all things that are happening in American politics, if anybody can figure that out. Welcome, Bill. So I wanted to get us in conversation by making an observation. We have represented here the three major population centers of Jews around the world, in America, in Israel, and in Europe. And Bernard, I want to start with you. As we assess the strength of the Jewish community in Europe, from anxiety to strength, how do you think it's going?
I like that you use the word of strength, to be frank, because Jews have been for so long weak, shy, as we say in French, hugging the walls, going in the shadow. And one of the peculiarities of our times for Jews all over the world, Europe, Israel, and America, is that this behavior is finished. The strength which we are committed to is a political strength, is, when it is needed, of course, a military strength, but above all, it is a spiritual, intellectual strength. When I compare the situation of the Jews in Europe to what it was at the time of our fathers and grandfathers, there is today a sense of a common commitment to Jewish values and world values, to Jewish study and liberal standards, which is really not a new thing, of course. It has always been the case, and there is no serious Jewish thinker who did not feel himself as involved and embedded in the world. But in such a large scale, in such a sense, going from the old generations, the young, and so on, this is a new thing. So for me today, the mark of our times is this new Jewish strength, Jewish pride, and Jewish commitment from Jewish background to the general values that make humanity a little less bad or a little better to breathe in.
Bill Kristol and Tzipi, if we look at this latest wave of terrorist violence now in Europe, and the response to it, what do you observe about where things are headed?
Well, first, you said that, look at the world from or through Jewish lenses.
Yeah.
What can we say? Oh, Gewalt. The world is changing. But first, I would like to say, just to start with something that we Israelis sometimes we are not saying enough, and I want to say to you all, thank you, Toda Rabba. Thank you for standing with Israel. Thank you for helping Israel. Thank you for advocating for Israel. I know that it's not easy sometimes, and I'm in the opposition in Israel, but Toda, I'm saying on behalf of the state of Israel and the people in Israel, and thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think that it's a part of the conversation that I'm certainly interested in, which is the relationship between Israel and American Jews, and we'll get to that. But I want to stay but in the headlines at the moment. The security environment, how do you assess it? Both what's happening in Europe in particular and the response to it.
Maybe I'll tell a story when I was foreign minister, and I don't know whether you recall, years ago, terror in a region, and some of these lunatics, religious guys, terrorists, ignited embassies in Syria, I think it was. And I came to the States and I had a meeting with President Bush. And he looked at me and he said, look at these terrorists, we need to cut their heads off. I said, okay, fine. On my way back to Israel, I stopped in Europe. And I had some meetings with the European leaders. And they asked me, what did we do wrong that we deserve this? And then I came back to Israel and I heard Israelis saying, oh, what a crazy world, this is a tough neighborhood and we need to defend ourselves. And I believe that this is very symbolic, because until terror entered Europe, unfortunately, for the European it was something far away, the Middle East. It was not even, they thought that it was not even their backyard. And they need to understand now that there is a religious war outside there. It's not the entire Islam against the others, but it is a religious war against those, all of us, whether it is radical Islam against moderate Islam, against Jews, against Christians, and there is nothing we can do to stop them in trying to appease them or try to understand them. We need to fight them. And this is an understanding, not only an understanding.
But fair enough, but Bill Kristol, we have been fighting.
Because they are against us, because of our values, because of who we are, not because of what we do. And therefore, it took some time to the world to understand it. I hope that the international community understands it now, but this is what needs to be done.
But we're also hearing, Bill Kristol, a kind of return to the rhetoric in this country from our leadership that we heard after 9/11, which is now we have to throw off the shackles of political correctness and go fight these guys. And the reality is we've been at war with Islamic terrorists since 2001. So the idea that we ever got off the war footing is a bit of a misnomer. That said, how do you assess what we're seeing now and the response to it?
Well, it's a dangerous world, and the world always surprises you. I mean, I'm old enough to remember growing up worrying so much 50 years ago tomorrow, I guess, at least on our calendar, when the war started in '67, and that Israel could genuinely be destroyed, and there could be really a second Shoah. That did not seem like a ridiculous threat, and it was certainly what the Arab leaders said, and the threat seemed to be a kind of Arab nationalism, a kind of Arab national socialism, you might call it, that was embodied by Nasser and Assad and others. That threat pretty much has gone away, I think one can say. The nation states near Israel has become a manageable situation.
The nature of the trade chain.
The Arab world has sort of probably come to grips with the fact that Israel isn't going away. And instead we had the rise of radical Islam and then of Islamist terror, which I don't know, very few people predicted this. There were a few people in France and England, far-seeing people in the 30s, 40s, 50s, but it's one of the great surprises. It's a good reminder of how much history can surprise one. And everyone's saying in universities, when I went to college in the 70s, secularism is on the rise. I mean, if you had said in 1972 at Harvard that, you know, there's going to be this resurgence of a militant form of Islam, that they'll take over Iran, a country that had good relations with Israel, that had good relations with us, that was modernizing in 1979, and then the Saudis in response are going to export Wahhabi Islam, and suddenly you're going to have real problems for Israel, real problems for us, and then in Europe, and here to some degree, thank God to a much lesser degree, you're going to have a self-radicalization of a second and I guess third generations of Arabs whose parents and grandparents were thrilled, I think, to come to France and to escape what they regarded as a backward kind of form of life in some of the countries they lived in. I mean, that is a good reminder of how uncertain history is. So I think it's a real threat. I think some of the rhetoric of Trump is foolish, but I think it's also true that some of the rhetoric of Obama was foolish, not quite as offensive as Trump's rhetoric, but misleading, self-misleading and misleading the public. The war is over. The two wars we're fighting is over. The arc of justice moves in the arc of history, moves towards justice. It's all very nice, but you know, you do need to. Bin Laden was not stupid when he said that some in the real world, especially in the Middle East, they respect the strong horse and not the weak horse. And I think in that respect, there maybe the good thing would be to have a coming together behind a sensible version of what it means to be a strong horse. That if we intervene in Libya, which BHL and I both supported, that we stay there and make sure that we do the right thing, that we have as good an outcome as possible. That we don't have presidents who say from the left or the right that, well, nation building, that's something we just can't afford to do anymore. We're war weary. We may be weary of the war, but the war is not weary of us.
So Bernard, if you look at European politicians like Theresa May saying enough is enough, so what is the European response likely to be? How is that likely to be different?
Number one, I think that Theresa May did find the good words yesterday night, the proper words. Number two, the right attitude is probably to stop with all the culture of excuse. They are not lunatics, and they are not poor people. It is not a matter of psychology, and it is not a matter of sociology. If we want to be serious in treating this, in dealing with this problem of terrorism, the start is to end with sociology and psychology. They are not poor, damned people, and they are not lunatic, crazy guys. Terrorism is a political and a religious phenomenon. Politically, they are National Socialists. They are the last pearl dropped by the National Socialist oyster. There is a genealogy, a history of the terrorism of today, which goes back, if you follow the thread properly, to the beginning of the 30s, when the National Socialist Revolution rised in Europe and spread all over the world, including the Arabic world. The Muslim Brotherhood, this should never be forgotten. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt at the end of the 20s as an Arabic reply to European National Socialism. And what we see today, Hamas, Hezbollah, Muslim Brotherhood of today, is really the inheritage of this first start. This is the political explanation, the political way of seeing terrorism. The religious way is more complicated. It has to do something, it has to deal with Islam. The two bad attitudes, number one is to say that it is Islam. Of course it is not. A lot of Muslims, maybe a majority all over the world, refuse this obscure conception of the Quran. But the other mistake would be to say that it has nothing to do with Islam. This nothing to doism is one of the worst mistakes we can commit. So, what we have to do in Europe is to raise properly the question, to see and to help our Muslim fellow citizens to understand what is going wrong, not with the Republican pattern, not with the citizenship of England or France, but what is going wrong with the relationship to Quran, with the way of reading the surat of the Quran, and which can produce such behaviors. We have to deal with this phenomenon on the religious ground and on a political ground. This is the task we have ahead, and this is what is starting to be done, I think, and I hope, in Europe.
We have a new administration. Minister Livni, we have a new administration here in Washington, which has promised, President Trump has promised, the ultimate deal in the Middle East, right? I mean, it's been 50 years, but now Jews and Arabs can rest assured that somebody can finally bring them together. Is there really a prospect for peace, do you think, with this new administration? Is there something different? Do you feel anything different?
You know, you ask this question with a smile on your face, and I heard some people, you know, kind of laughing. It's about our life. I wish Trump would succeed to achieve the ultimate deal.
Yeah.
This is...
Right, but let's be clear. The humor in my question, Minister Livni.
But I would explain why the reason of...
No, let me explain. You said the humor in my question was about anyone who would approach something that is so difficult and so complex and say, oh no, I can get the ultimate deal, as if no one else has been trying. So that's why I ask you, is there something different in this moment?
Actually, it's less important for me the way he said it. But the moment in which President Trump stood with the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, here in the press conference, and he said, I'm serious, I want a deal, this was the moment in which I became more optimistic, because the reason for me to be in politics in Israel is to achieve this deal, because I believe that the way to keep the values of Israel as a Jewish democratic state, and we'll speak about it later, is to try and focus on the values of Israel, on the nature of Israel, and to separate ourselves from the Palestinians and to divide, unfortunately, as we need to do, the land of Israel. And basically, without this, stagnation and stalemate is not an option, because this can bring us to a situation in which we would wake up one morning and find ourselves in a one-state solution between Jordan River, Mediterranean Sea, with another millions of Palestinians living there. And this would be, hopefully not, that it would not happen, but this can lead to the end of all the idea, the great dream, the Zionist dream of the state of Israel.
But I understand that. I'm trying to, I want,
so
can you assess
why I
what's
believe
different?
that there is an opportunity now? Okay,
yes.
I'll say why. Firstly, I believe, and the Arab world, and I have also some contacts with some of the leaders there, they want to make peace with Israel. They cannot do it because the glass ceiling is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But trust me, I heard about the Iranian threat in Arabic more than I heard it in Hebrew and English together. So they understand that Iran is their threat, they want to make peace with Israel, they want to have Israel as one of these camps who is fighting against Iran, but they cannot do it, and they want to, you know, to take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict off the table. Nice, it's good. Secondly, we have the Palestinians. We were talking about Europe. For many years now, when the Palestinians didn't negotiate with Israel, and any agreement, any deal, you know, in Obamic, making a deal, the meaning is making peace. You know, it sounds more, you know, deal, but it's making peace. And the Palestinians, when Trump was elected, they felt that, okay, now he's going to support Israel in annexing the territories, doing something. Until the last years, when they didn't negotiate with Israel, they could go to Europe and have the support of Europe on everything they wanted. So basically, they got the support on a Palestinian state, 67 line, Jerusalem its capital, all the United Nations resolution, no matter what. But now Europe is focused on Europe. And the Palestinians are less important to Europeans. So the Palestinians took all the demands that they asked from Israel as conditions to renegotiate and took it aside. And now they want to negotiate because Trump is here and nobody wants to say no to Trump. And let's come to Israel. Also in Israel, you have a president that basically said in his visit to Israel, you see, I'm here. I came, Obama didn't, but I came. I went to the Trump went to the Western Wall, embraced Israel, said I'm your friend. I would stand with you on Israel's security, but I believe that it's important for Israel to make a deal, and I believe that also for Israelis, it's a moment in which, when Trump said to Netanyahu, you are a partner for peace, and that Abu Mazen is a partner for peace, I believe that all those in Israel who thought that when Trump was elected, now we can annex the territories and do whatever we want, well, surprise, surprise. And from my perspective, it's a good surprise.
So, Bill, is something surprised you about this moment of leadership? We're going to hear from the National Security Advisor momentarily, H.R. McMaster. Is there a ripeness to this moment politically that you think is there?
You know, I don't know. As I said before, history, the one thing I've learned over the years is history surprises one. One could have made a lot of money betting that the two Israeli withdrawals from occupied territory in the history of Israel, really, the two major ones since '67 were done by Begin, notoriously hawkish believer in Greater Israel, the disciple of Jabotinsky, and then by Sharon in 2005. So, it's not, as I agree with Tzipi, that it's not, history works in funny ways, and I don't like Trump, and I think it's childish to say that I can do this when no one else has done it, but, the stars could line up in such a way that it could happen, I suppose. I think I'm not a big fan of Trump. I'm a big fan of his national security team. I think we got lucky there, and I think they will keep the U.S. more than I would have thought 4 months ago on a general path of responsibility and maintaining the liberal international order, which I think is the key to everything else. I mean, we just take so much for granted that 75 years of relative peace, of relative progress in many ways, of no World War I, no World War II. We let some things go too far in the Balkans and in Rwanda and elsewhere, but basically a decent world order with an awful lot of people coming out of poverty in Asia, an unbelievable number in Asia, with a country like Israel flourishing from 1948 till today. We take that for granted much too much. And so I think H.R. McMaster, whom I have a very high opinion of, understands that. I think Jim Mattis understands it. Mike Pompeo understands it. I don't think Trump really understands it. But look, I mean, he appointed those people. I will say this. I think when historians, if the Trump presidency is non-disastrous, which I think is 50-50 or something like that. I'm Jewish, so I'm entitled to be a little pessimistic. But I think the replacement, and this has been under-noticed, I would say. The replacement of Mike Flynn by H.R. McMaster 27 days into the presidency is really going to be viewed by historians as a key moment. I honestly would be very worried about the future of U.S.-European relationships, of U.S.-Israel, of our general role as an anchor of the liberal world order if Donald Trump were there with General Flynn, whom I knew a little bit when he was in government, and I respect, but I think would have been a very, very bad national security advisor. I think with General McMaster there, we have a chance to maybe channel some of Trump's impetuousness and some of that in a good direction, as Tzipi said, to maybe try to do some good things and to curb some of his less responsible instincts. Having said that, I think it is I just want to say for the record and be clear, it's a bad thing to have someone win the U.S. presidency on a slogan of America First. It's a bad thing to have someone win the U.S. presidency saying, we can get out of, everyone's ripping us off, and we should either get out these alliances. If they don't cough up the money, we're going to break them up. And all we do anymore is lose wars, and we haven't accomplished anything, and the trade deals are all bad. It's mostly just silly rhetoric. He's not acting on most of it. But it's dangerous. It's dangerous. These things this all didn't happen. Us sitting here in this very nice place, hundreds of millions of people in China and India living decent lives, relative peace in most of the world, even the successes we have had in beating back the Islamist terrorist threat. Those things don't just happen automatically. And I do worry that with a president of the U.S. who doesn't understand the key role of the U.S. as a leadership of allies in confronting those threats and in continuing to make progress, that's a worrisome situation.
We've put a few issues on the table, and I want to pick up on that point. I just want to pick up on the point that Bill's making about the America First phenomenon, and you all can address this. As we think about Jews in this country and in Europe and in Israel, this surge of populism in our politics, what does it mean? How did it get here? And does it pose a persistent challenge to Jews in our various parts of the world? Bill, pick up on that point, and
I'll be very brief.
I'll address it.
Let Tzipi and BHL address it. I would say, no, I am worried in the sense that we now have dominant on campuses, represented, unfortunately, to some degree in the Democratic Party, to some degree in the last administration, a kind of enlightened cosmopolitanism that I don't think is very friendly to the state of Israel, because Israel is a nationalist, historically grounded, somewhat religious, you might say, friendly to religion, country that believes you've got to be strong and stand and fight for yourself if you have to. Very against the spirit, I think, of a certain kind of liberal cosmopolitanism that is not accidentally anti-Israel and fairly anti-American. So that's on the left. And on the right, we now have America First populism. I don't think it's actually that deep in this country. I don't think most Trump voters really believe it. I think he won for a bunch of somewhat random reasons. But it is what he said. It didn't put off voters as much as I would have liked. And I think it's worrisome that those two strains, you might say, neither of which, in my opinion, is good for Israel or good for the Jews, really, or good for Judaism. Those two strains are stronger in America than they have been for a while.
Ben Bernard, you've been outspoken about this in France. I mean, that France narrowly avoided Le Pen. What do you see in this surging populism through Europe, through the United States, and what it means for Jews?
We not only avoided Le Pen, we avoided Le Pen and her twin, her brother, who is named Mr. Mélenchon. Because we have the peculiarity in France to have the two faces of populism. You have some countries in Europe who face the rightist populism, like Austria. You have some countries who face the leftist populism. We have both. And the merit of Mr. Macron, his virtue, is to have defeated both of them, which is really a great performance. And regarding the Jews, both of them, Mélenchon and Le Pen, represented a real danger. I cannot forget that in 2014, when we had in Paris some anti-Jewish demonstration, attacking some synagogues, attacking some so-called Jewish shops, in these demonstrations, you had some followers of Mr. Mélenchon, and Mr. Mélenchon, the leftist populist, did not find one word to condemn these anti-Jewish attacks. And not only he did not find a word, but he even said, he praised the Republican values embodied by these demonstrators. So today in France, both of them have been provisionally defeated. Number two, the populist is not a new thing. Populism is as old as democracy. The Greeks had their populism when they said they had two words to say the people, the Greeks. There was the word demos, and there was the word oklos, which meant the demos, the people, when it degenerates into populism. The Romans, the Latins, had also two words. They had the noble populus, and they knew that there is always in every populus the temptation, the risk of degenerating in plebs, plebeian people. The Jews, they had the people of Moses, and they had the populist people of Korah. Who was Korah except the first populist temptation in the history of the Jewish people? Populist meaning we don't need any superior, any high law. We don't need any transcendence. The assembly is holy by itself. It was the birth of a populist temptation inside the Jewish world. So populism is an old story. This arm wrestling between the two definitions of populism is as old as the people. We are facing today a particularly critical moment of this long story. And what we need is to find again a sense of democracy which matches again with the populace, with the demos, and with the assembly anticora. We have to refine this. We have to refine a conception of democracy who puts again above the assembly of the people some sort of a law, some sort of natural right, as said the inventors of the Republican idea. This is the challenge of today, not for the Jews, for all of us, even if the Jews have probably a special word to say in this matter.
Tzipi, I think a lot of people in this audience and who are watching us via webcast, I speak specifically about American Jews. We heard Rabbi Buchdahl, who was here earlier from Central Synagogue in New York, such a vibrant congregation. One of her congregants, her president, in fact, of her congregation, Abby Pogerman, wrote a book, My Jewish Year, in which she says, most American Jews less and less identify their Jewishness with Judaism. It's much more a Jewish identity about Israel. And that can be tough, because Israel is a complicated place. And if we as a Jewish community in America allow our identity to be defined purely by what happens in Israel, we can be left bereft spiritually. So how do you see the relationship from Israel between Zion and between American Jews?
Well, I believe that we need to open a new dialogue between Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people and the world Jewry. I believe that we should put aside the old dialogue, saying we are a safe shelter in case of anti-Semitism, come to Israel, make Aliyah, and be with us, and until that day, help and stand with Israel in challenging times. This is something that we do, but this is not enough. Being a Jew, it's a matter of values as well. It's not just being a shelter in the Middle East to the world Jewry. And I believe that we need to redefine, firstly, what does it mean to be a Jewish democratic state? Before even we are talking about the communities here. And we need to speak about it together, not only us Israelis. Because it tells something and it affects your life as well, and the feeling and the connection between young people here in the Jewish communities in the state and their feeling toward Israel. And when we define Israel, and I believe that the definition of a Jewish democratic state, these two words in one sentence, is a nation state of the Jewish people with equal rights to all its citizens. And I believe that equality is Jewish value, not only a favor that Judaism is doing to the democratic nature of Israel. And we need to have this discussion first and foremost in Israel. And then we need to work on this together. And I said nation state of the Jewish people. The meaning is not a religious state. And the meaning is that the monopoly of the Jewishness of the state of Israel shouldn't be given to the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel. Yeah. And we need to work together in an understanding that you can express your Judaism in different ways.
Right. That's very significant for you to say. I will just say, as a Reformed Jew, I appreciate that, because there's a lot of religious authorities in Israel who want to dictate whether I'm an authentic Jew, which I don't appreciate. But Bill, I want to have you comment on this. I advanced an argument about, again, what I observe in American Judaism as being a lot about Jewish identity defined by Israel rather than Judaism. Do you see it that way? How do you describe the extent to which the Jewish community is flourishing in this country?
Well,
you have 30 seconds.
Yeah. What is the old joke? Is in a different context, there are going to be fewer Jews but better Jews in the United States, it looks like. And that's true. I mean, it's pretty pathetic that the wealthiest, most successful, most tolerated and most advanced, you might say, Jewish community, a community that's done so well in the United States, is shrinking. And now that's fine. It's a free country. People can marry out, and people can leave, and people cannot choose not to be affiliated. But it's a fact, and it is a serious problem. Now, the good news, I think, is the revival of Jewish a real interest among, and this I think does go across the board, not just for the Orthodox, or certainly not the ultra-Orthodox, simply in Judaism. And so I think we have a fairly vibrant Judaism in the United States, which is good. The Jewish community as a whole is a mixed story, honestly. That's something that an awful lot of people at the AJC over decades, my uncle worked there 40 years ago and wrote articles about the danger of the shrinking Jewish community, which has practical effects, of course, in American politics and other ways. And so that's a mixed story. I want to say two quick things, though, just to be contrarian a little bit. In theory and principle, I think it's a matter of Jewish belief. One should separate a little bit the question of Israel from the question of Judaism. But I think it's a truly practical matter in the 21st century, no Israel, no Judaism. I do not believe Judaism could survive as a true flourishing faith if Israel were destroyed. I think there would be Jews, there would be certainly the Haredi would continue to be keep the tradition alive, which would be great. It would be like the small Protestant sect somewhere like the Amish or something. But I do think Israel is now central to the future of Judaism after the Shoah. So I don't think I'm not one of those who thinks it's so terrible that American Jews in part define their Judaism as Israel. Israel is the embodiment of the national spirit of the Jewish people. And Judaism was always about a national spirit as well as about certain principles and certain beliefs. So I'm not as upset about that. And as for the Haredi and the ultra-Orthodox, believe me, I'm not one, and I have my issues with them. But I will always pay tribute to them for keeping alive tradition, for keeping alive beliefs that were not easy to keep alive. And certainly that in the U.S., I can't speak on the Israeli situation, but in the U.S., it's very easy to sit here and, I mean, we owe a huge amount, I would say, to the observant and to the ultra-Orthodox, as much as one sometimes is frustrated by them.
I just want to, I appreciate that point. Just before I turn to Bernard, I don't even see it as a bipolar point between you and I. In other words, I of course believe in a center place of Israel in any Jewish identity, but it does seem that in America there is it's either your Jewishness is about Israel or it's basically nothing else. And I would argue that it can have a place, Bernard, that can be central, can be about love and Zionism, but can be part of a larger kind of Jewish identity and existence. How do you see it from a European perspective, where Israel fits into Jewish life for a Jew in Israel, for a Jew in Europe?
In Europe. Yeah. In Europe and in America. As far as I'm concerned, I am, I must say, unconditionally faithful to Israel. I tried all my life since 1967 to be there when Israel was challenged, under attack, or under existential threat. I tried to do it by all means, including reporting in difficult media conditions in Europe about the wars to which Israel was compelled, Gaza, Lebanon, and so on. So my link with Israel is very, very strong. But what I would say is that if Israel is part of my strength, it is not the whole of my identity. It is two different things. Each Jew in the world, every single Jew in America, even if he does not admit it, even if he is not aware of it, owes part of his strength, of her strength, of her way of behaving and standing in the world to the very existence of Israel. This is a new phenomenon which our ancestors did not know. And I know a lot of anti-Israeli Jews who are unaware, but who feel it in a way of this law. They owe part of their pride to the very existence of Israel. After that, identity, what it is to be a Jew, is another story. Israel is not enough. To be a Jew is to have a certain relationship to a text, to a memory, to the way of reading a text, to the way of making alive and vibrant a certain memory. This is part and maybe the core of the Jewish identity. And going to America, I'm not an expert, and I know America much less than my friend Bill Kristol and than yourself. But for a recent book which was published recently, I made a tour of a few cities in America. And I met a lot of American Jews. And I'm sorry, but I may be wrong, but my impression in many cities, West Coast, East Coast, center of America, was the impression of a link, solid, vibrant, and not reduced to a sort of vague, pale, automatic, mechanical fidelity to Israel. There is in this country, this is what I felt, there are in all sorts of circles, in big business, among simple people, there is a commitment to the Jewish values and a commitment to the linkage between these Jewish values and the values of the city, which seems to me remarkable and which did not exist to such an extent 30 years ago. For me, there is an awakening in America of the sense of being a Jew in correlation with Jewish values, Jewish text, and sometimes Jewish study.
Well said, all of you. We're going to leave it there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Off we go.